We are so happy to have you here today. For those in the room, please take out your cell phones and ensure they're silenced so as not to distract from today's presentation. Also, welcome to the large crowd joining via Zoom in the Haas virtual classroom. A special thank you to our volunteer course technician, David Blatt. David, yay. If you've joined the Haas virtual classroom as a participant, you have the skills necessary to serve as a course technician. And you won't be alone. You will be teamed with an experienced course technician to learn the simple responsibilities of this important position. If interested, please contact hasp@hope.edu for more information. Are you receiving the weekly Haas Happenings email? These colorful and picture-filled emails are shared every Sunday morning and provide updates on the upcoming week's courses, special events, Hope College programs, and service opportunities, as well as important registration links. Make your HASP experience easy and find out what's happening. Visit the front desk today after class if you are not already receiving this communication. Next, as we approach a new month, we're happy to invite you to our monthly program hosted this coming Tuesday, November 1st at 9:30 at the Jack H. Miller Center for Musical Arts. The presentation is titled, Why We Need President Ford Today, presented by Gleaves Whitney, Executive Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. Surprise. Coffee and cookies will be served beginning at 9 o'clock. Bring a friend. We hope to see you there. One last reminder, please hold your comments and questions until David or I can approach you with a microphone. This ensures our virtual listeners and those connected to our in-class loop system can actively hear and participate in the conversation. Thank you. Now on to the important event we have today. How did we entice Karen Segal to visit us from Traverse City? We were assisted by her memories as a double history and poli-sci major at Hope College. Karen's first job at the State Department was a result of participating in Hope's Washington semester program, then under the direction of Professor Hoeksema. Ronald Reagan had just been elected for the first time. The Soviet Union was collapsing, and there seemed no better time to work on U.S.-Russian relations. Since then, she has taught, directed the International Affairs Forum in Traverse City, and written numerous articles on the U.S. arms control policy. One of Karen's favorite stories is that she got to attend the White House event during Gorbachev's first visit to Washington, D.C. She can tell you her reaction to seeing Reagan and Gorbachev shedding tears together. Another highlight of Karen's career was being sent to Siberia with her husband to open the first ever U.S. consulate in Yekaterinburg, Yeltsin's hometown. Initially, there was no building, no staff, but they embraced the incredible opportunity to build American-Russian ties in an area long blocked from the West. The couple more recently returned for the 25th anniversary and found remarkable progress. I know we're all anxious to hear Karen's views on the current status of America's relationship with Russia and how she envisions its future. There's lots to discuss, so let's begin. Please give Karen a hearty HASP welcome.
Can you hear me? Okay, all right. I am just delighted to be here. And for this topic, there's not a lot of time. And so we're going to go right into the film. As this suggests, the film in many ways is already outdated because what Great Decisions is already putting out its programs for next year. And you'll see that the topic for next year is simply war crimes. And I think you'll find that in watching this today, it was made before Russia went into Ukraine. And so it is a bit outdated, but for that very reason, I think it's also a valuable foundation for us to begin our discussion of what we thought before and where we are today. And let me just say, as a way of background, I was very fortunate to be involved in U.S.-Russia relations at a time when relations were flourishing. And when I look back at the long history of Russia, you often find small periods of reform, small periods of optimism almost always followed by kind of slamming the door shut, because Russia has always defaulted to autocracy, whether it was the czars or whether it was Soviet leaders or whether it's Putin today. But I am lucky because I at least was part of that optimistic period where you can imagine where Russia could go with different leadership. So I'm delighted to be here today, and I'm going to start the film now. And then we'll talk immediately after. If I cut the film short by a few minutes, it's because it really is out of date, and I feel like we have a lot of pressing things to talk about, so I might do that. So, okay, but here we go.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions 2022, a masterclass brought to you by the Foreign Policy Association. Topics 1, 2, and 3 are non-traditional in nature. They're not the stuff of old-fashioned geopolitics and geostrategic struggles among major powers. For these next 3 foreign policy challenges, Russia and the United States, Myanmar and ASEAN, and the Quad Alliance, were on more traditional terms. Today's topic, of course, is U.S.-Russian relations. We begin with an overview of the Russian Federation. It is an incredibly large nation state. The Soviet Union was the largest country in the world. It broke up into 15 different countries, and yet the Russian Federation, which of course succeeded it, remains the largest country to be found. Its population is at 146 million. It is the 11th largest economy in the international system. And finally, and quite importantly, the Russian Federation is a nuclear superpower. So where does Russia get its strength? Part of it is leadership. Since the beginning of this century, Vladimir Putin has been the dominant political actor in the country. He has been quite stable and consistent in his leadership, even though there are many Western objections to his style and to his foreign policy. At home, he has kept that country together. Secondly, you have a very strong military, both conventional and nuclear. That gives Russia a great deal of global strength and presence. Thirdly, the diplomatic corps is impressive, and the intelligence agency is pervasive in the international system. The Russian predecessor, the Soviet Union, like its predecessor, the Russian Empire, had a very large diplomatic footprint that has not changed. And finally, Russia is home to a remarkable wealth of resources. It has more gold than any country in the world, more silver, more oil, more fresh water. It is just an amazingly large bastion of natural resources. Being able to access those resources is a separate question, but the Russians do possess them. This is the image of Russia and its leader that Vladimir Putin would like for the world to always see, sort of that rough and rugged approach, taming the wild bear that one would not want to corner. What is Vladimir Putin's strategy in foreign policy? The first is to promote autocratic or non-democratic rule abroad. Vladimir Putin will assist in undermining democratic institutions in other countries to gain favor with emerging dictators. Secondly, he is fighting in relatively modest or low intensity proxy struggles with the United States. The Russians would not directly engage the Americans, We have devastating military power in comparison, but the Russians can try to undermine our allies abroad and align with our adversaries. Thirdly, he hopes to reverse the Cold War's end. Putin has spoken about the disintegration of the Soviet Union as an historic catastrophe that should be reversed. He can make modest gains along these lines, grabbing Crimea several years ago as an example, pressuring Belarus and Georgia, Kazakhstan and Ukraine, other examples. He's not going to be able to reverse, however, the independence of the vast majority of those countries. And finally, his aim is to undermine Western unity. As long as the United States is aligned with France and England, Germany and Italy, Japan and Australia, the Russians will always be in a secondary position. He would like to see Western powers divide, disagree, and separate. And of course, he is making every effort to promote that. Without any doubt, the Russians were promoting Brexit through social media pressures. And without any doubt, the Russians are promoting divides within the West European continent over issues such as COVID mandates, immigration, and EU law between Poland, Hungary, Germany, Italy, and others. So undermining Western unity is yet another part of Russia's strategy. Very meaningful debate happened in 2012, perhaps the most impressive foreign policy debate at the presidential level. This, of course, between Mr. Romney, the challenger, and Mr. Obama, the president. It was over the strength of Russia. Is Russia our number one geopolitical threat, or is it nuclear weapons in general, the Islamic State, climate change, or some other threat? And these two had a very impressive debate over where Russia fits in our geopolitical concern levels. Russo-American relations over time have been in flux. They've changed rather dramatically as the global context changes. This line we place on the graph we'll call neutrality. Anything above it would be warm relations. Anything below it would be cool or cold relations. Up until 1917, I would say the United States and Russia were largely neutral towards one another. They certainly knew of each other's existence. They calculated that into their foreign policy, but we weren't really engaged in Europe, and the Russians weren't really engaged in our hemisphere. In 1917, that would change because of the Russian Revolution and the advent of the communist Soviet Union. Our relationship with the Russians became very cold after 1917 and remained so until the late 1930s. But we needed the Russians because the Soviet Union was a potential ally against Nazi Germany. It became one of the Allied members fighting against the Axis powers, and so our relationship was much warmer. It doesn't mean we cared for the Soviets, nor did they care for us. Very minimal levels of trust, an anticipation that once this war was over, the two of us will go back to our chilled relationship, but at the time, necessity dictated an alliance against the Germans, Italians, and Japanese. When World War II was over, our relationship became very cold. First, it was the atomic bomb, the advent of the hydrogen, the nuclear and thermonuclear, regional conflicts, global ideological disagreement. The relationship could not be any worse without there being an outright war between the two superpowers. When the Cold War ended, Mr. Yeltsin came to power and he accommodated almost every American demand on Europe, on NATO, on Russian behavior. This was a very warm period for U.S.-Russian relations. But then with the arrival of Mr. Putin, the relationship began to decline, get cooler and cooler over time, to the point that today I would say it's somewhere between the peak in the 1990s and the depths of the 1960s and 70s. I would call this a normal relationship among major powers. Mr. Trump showed a warming to Russia when he was inaugurated as president in 2017. Why would he do that? Well, in part because he seems to have a healthy respect for strong men, and very few are stronger than Vladimir Putin. The America First approach demands it. In order to pursue a foreign policy based on America First principles, you must convince your allies that adversaries are not as threatening as they appear. This allows you to justify retracting from the world. A recognition of common interests between Russia and the United States. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, it's been the norm for more than 3 decades now. Bill Clinton tried to reset relations with the Russian Federation. He was largely successful in doing so. The junior George Bush made the same effort with Vladimir Putin, as did Obama, and of course, as did Mr. Trump. In fact, I think Joe Biden is going to be the first U.S. president since the Cold War not to attempt to reset relations with Russia and improve our dialogue on a daily basis. In order to consider American foreign policies towards Russia, we must first take into account the question of rise. Is Russia on the rise? Number 2, what are its main vulnerabilities? And finally, what is the extent of this great power threat that emanates from Russia? We begin with Russia and its position moving forward. There is a perception game going on in world politics as it relates to Russia. If we were to ask Vladimir Putin, what is the trajectory of Russia moving forward, he would say things were very, very bad in 2000. That's when he came to power. But over the course of the past 2 decades and moving forward for the rest of this century, things look rather rosy. Russia has reestablished itself as a great power. It is reasserting itself in global affairs. It is increasingly ambitious and risk acceptant. If we were to poll the foreign policy establishment members, and there are thousands of people that make up the U.S. foreign policy establishment, they would probably disagree with Vladimir Putin on everything except 2000. Everyone agrees that in 2000, Russia was in a lot of trouble. They would recognize that Vladimir Putin did straighten out the Russian Federation, did give it strength, but they're not nearly as bullish or optimistic about Russia's power and influence by the end of the century. The trend line, however, is positive. When I look at this situation, I analyze Russia, and I'll call this my reality. I see very minimal gains after 2030 and rather sharp declines around 2040. I am not impressed with Russia moving forward. It is to me a great power in clear decline with highly recognizable vulnerabilities, and that is going to be a significant factor in our calculation of foreign policy options. What are the country's vulnerabilities then? Why am I so unimpressed with Russia? Well, it unfolds on all 3 of the most important variables for determining a nation's future. You might remember this slide from the very first lecture on demographics when I expressed how population is a very important variable for determining future movement. But for the Russians, all 3 of these are highly negative. The geography is not very impressive. I mean, granted, you've got lots of natural resources, you can't get to them. They're in the frozen tundra of Siberia. Insurance costs will drive you out of business. Infrastructure is non-existent. The river system is impressive in terms of linear calculation, but these rivers are not like the Mississippi, the Colorado, or so many other American waterways. Our rivers connect large population centers. It makes them perfect vehicles to navigate for trade. That's just not the case in Russia. Most of their rivers dump into oceans that no one would use, and they go towards population centers that are remarkably small. So geographically, Russia does not impress me. Geostrategically, Well, when you eyeball it, you think Russia's in a pretty good position. It's at the top of the world. It dominates the Arctic. It doesn't have that many borders with other great powers. But in reality, there are 4 significant geostrategic weak spots for Russia. The first is what we used to call Leningrad. Currently, it is St. Petersburg. Very large, thoroughly impressive city, commercial center, large population, urban area, incredibly vulnerable. Very little way for the Russian Navy to protect St. Petersburg from a coordinated attack. Weakness number 2 is along the western boundary. Those are open fields. Panzer divisions could roll through them very easily, as they did in the early 1940s. This is an area of grave concern for Russia, and why I've always argued Belarus and Ukraine must be under Russian control for the Russians to have any sense of security vis-a-vis the West. Area number 3, the Caucasus. This is that divide between the Russian Federation, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. This is a very real area of concern and a very long border to guard. And then finally, we have that stunningly long border with China. China, an economically more impressive country. Very quickly, China is developing a more impressive military on every level except nuclear weapons. And with Chinese demands for energy increasing, you have to think that Beijing is looking northward into Siberia at all of those deposits of natural gas, of oil, and natural resources. This border, however, is far too long for the Russians to effectively guard. These are the 4 weak geostrategic points of the Russian Federation. And then finally, we have the demographic question about Russia. It is absolutely miserable. This is a population that is disappearing. The government has intervened, incentives for people to have more babies. That has had a modest impact, but not nearly enough to avoid the demographic cliff that Russia is facing in this century. For these reasons, Russia does not, in my opinion, pose a growing threat in any way, shape, or form to world politics except through the possession of its nuclear stockpile. Population, as you can see from this graph, clearly in decline. But decline is not good, even for a bitter enemy of the United States. We can establish thresholds for each and every country in the world. The upper threshold is the maximum power that we're comfortable that country having, and then the lower threshold is the minimum power or strength that we are comfortable with. For every country, these thresholds move up and down the power level. For Russia, they're relatively high. But if it is within the upper and lower threshold, that's something that's manageable to us. We can deal with that. Russia today is in the manageable range. If, however, the adversary's strength becomes too high, we have to deal with it. But the good news is we can deal with it. Economic sanctions, military intervention. Saddam Hussein of Iraq became too powerful when he invaded Kuwait. That was not a difficult problem to solve. We weakened him back to a manageable level. The real problem is when the adversary's strength is too low, because there are very few levers at our disposal to deal with an enemy that doesn't have a solid base and begins the process of disintegration. Look at Afghanistan after 2001, Iraq after 2003, Libya after 2011. These were all grave foreign policy miscalculations because our interventions pushed those countries below the lower threshold, and suddenly we have countries that cannot hold themselves together. Imagine if that scenario happened in the Russian Federation, and it almost did in the 1990s. The Russian Federation itself was disintegrating in the aftermath of the Soviet Union falling apart. Unsecured nuclear weapons were a grave concern. There was an ongoing war in Chechnya, a war that the leadership in Moscow may not have even authorized. Incompetent leadership at the top, and a number of near-miss second strikes on nuclear policy. On more than one occasion, Boris Yeltsin was approached with the news that the Americans have launched ICBM missiles, nuclear capable, against Russia. What, Mr. President, do you want to do about it? And when you have someone in office who is not mentally stable, who is far too oftentimes hitting the bottle, you do not want that question asked very often. And there he is in 1996 running for re-election. I never understood why the Clinton administration supported Yeltsin's re-election to the point that it did, offering very large IMF loans if and only if Boris Yeltsin is re-elected as president of Russia. Because he's an individual that was highly unstable and very difficult to predict. Here he is literally bombing the parliament in Moscow, destroying democracy before our eyes due to his frustration with those policymakers who would not agree with him. Moscow's grip on the country, very high during the old Soviet days, began to decline at the time of Mikhail Gorbachev, reaching a low point in the late 1990s with Yeltsin in power, only rebounding with the arrival of Vladimir Putin. But that low point is literally one of the most dangerous times in all of human history, because we wondered if the Russian Federation was on the cusp of disintegrating itself into a host of different countries, regions, and power centers, potentially with many of them possessing long-range ICBMs with nuclear warheads on them. What is the extent of the Russian threat to global security and the United States? We can place countries on a threat spectrum. In fact, it's not just the country that goes on the spectrum, it's the country's threats individually that go on the spectrum. On the high end are the nuclear weapons of Russia. It has more than we do. It has more than any other country in the world. It has well over half the world's nuclear warheads. That gives it enormous threat capability. But everything beyond that is relatively low range. Not overly threatening. We're not intimidated by the Russian army. There's not a lot abroad in terms of forces that the Russians can muster that threaten us, threaten regional stability or our allies. So what are American foreign policy options? Well, it begins with a series of questions. Is a new Cold War with Russia inevitable? Well, the answer here is absolutely not. I understand that we don't like Vladimir Putin. We certainly don't like the way he appears to try to push us and our allies around. That does not mean that an historically cold relationship must exist. Do we share common interest? Absolutely. The Russians are not after global instability. They're after Western disunity. Can we force the Russians into submission so that they'll change policy? No, we can't do that. That's a bridge too far. What should be our priority with the Russian Federation? No doubt about it, it's the nuclear weapons. Returning to the table, negotiating in ways that reflect both Moscow's and Washington's strategic interest to head off arms races happening in Asia and to begin to continue the process of lowering nuclear weapons levels. A soft approach? Well, this is a risk-reward calculation. We've been trying to reset relations with Russia for 30 years. The thinking is that it'll lead to cooperation in critical areas. This is what we learned from Henry Kissinger in the early 70s. This was the underlying feature of détente, which led to great breakthroughs in nuclear arms agreements. It could lead to agreements on regional conflicts and maybe even a new era of détente between the United States and the Russian Federation. This is the reward side of a reset. The dangers, however, are significant because if we try to reset and cooperate, it may send a signal to our allies that we're no longer in it for the whole, we're in it individually. We're going to pursue our own policy with the Russians, and that could cede at least some portion of Europe back to the Russians. So the risk-reward of a soft policy has to be taken into account. Sanctions against Russia, always an option, probably preferred to military engagement. We have to keep in mind, however, that if we sanction Russia for its bad acts, it is going to take that out on our European allies. If we're unhappy with Russian behavior in London, poisoning a dissident, or in destabilizing the Syrian conflict, that we economically sanction it, it means the Germans, the Ukrainians, and the French are all going to pay a higher price tag at the pump because Russia is a main provider of oil, gas, and natural gas to Europe, Central, and West. Cybercrime and election meddling are two of the most frustrating aspects of Russian foreign policy these days. The Russians are hurting us, and they have to pay a price for that. Russians.
Okay, I'm sorry to stop there, but it's so the way the world was 3 or 4 years ago, and I'm sure we all remember the elections and Russian meddling and all the rest. But it almost seems these days like, oh, those were the good old days. Because the world has become so much more complicated. And so again, I don't want to nitpick all of the video because I think it says something really important that I'm going to come back to at the end that I think is foundational. But I also think he obviously completely missed the idea of Russia invading Ukraine. And so when he was even discussing about the threat perception or the threat assessment, he said, you've got the nuclear threat, and otherwise he doesn't see the ability for Russia to actually do something to regional stability or to our allies. And we know that. We have seen that that is not the case. So let's stop that video now and come back to a discussion about this. But yes, as I said at the beginning, this was probably made, it came out more than a year ago. So he must have started making it a year and a half ago or 2 years. And what a difference a year makes. And as I mentioned, what you're going to see for next year, if you engage in these Great Decision series, is the part for Russia is simply called war crimes. So that's how they're looking at the future. So what I'd like to do is to try to briefly review the Ukraine war, bring it up to date. Then we'll talk about Putin's motivations and his reasoning, and then we'll return to that strategic picture, which I think this video had something very important to say. I'm going to go quickly because I think it's really important. This is such an important topic to allow you to have questions. And if you do want to interrupt while I'm doing this, please raise your hand. Otherwise, we'll kind of go through it and then we'll open up from there. So let's recap. February of this year, Russia moved into Ukraine, a massive assault. Honestly, most experts did not think that Putin was going to do this. Oh, he would want to retake and increase on the east where he already was. But Putin went for the entire country. And it was first time since World War II that a sovereign nation in Europe had been invaded. So we're looking at from 4 directions, a large ground invasion, missiles, rockets, airstrikes hitting across Ukraine, including in Kyiv. And most military analysts predicted that Ukraine would fall. I mean, you simply look at sheer numbers, right? You look at the size of Ukraine, you look at the size of Russia, you look at how many military forces are on both sides, and you say, oh, wow, this is going to be bad. Leads to the largest refugee crisis since World War II, 7.7 million dispersed across Europe. 8 million displaced within Ukraine. Half of all children are out of their homes. Maybe surprisingly, we don't think about this, but we also witnessed the largest exodus from Russia itself for over 100 years. Israel talks about they were prepared for Ukrainian refugees, and instead they've gotten more Russians than Ukrainians at this point. Atrocities. Yeah, you will all remember Bucha, the massacre of civilians, torture and rape of women, children, obviously war crimes because they are attacking civilian targets. And yet, despite this, it only seems to strengthen the Ukrainian resolve, creating more of a sense of Ukrainian nationality. The indiscriminate violence, it made this a very personal conflict where it was hard to say where the front lines were. And the casualties, the US estimates that 70 to 80,000 Russians were killed or wounded, much smaller Ukrainian numbers, but honestly, it's very hard to say. And if you listen to what the Russians say, it's one thing and one thing from the Ukrainians, but there's no question of the devastation. But just a month in, it's clear that Putin has miscalculated. He has miscalculated the Ukrainian resistance. He's miscalculated the strength of international support for Ukraine, and he's miscalculated his own problems within his military. They're undisciplined, there's failed logistics, communications collapse, low morale, etc. And what happens is they can't take Kyiv. So this is a picture of just days into the war. There was a 40-mile-long Russian convoy of tanks waiting to come into Kyiv, and they never made it. So it kind of symbolized the stalling of the advance. And meanwhile, what do we have? The Ukrainians mobilizing. They added 500,000 more troops. They're fighting hard because they are fighting for their country. Much of the credit, I think, has to go to this man. How many of you have know anything about Zelensky? Have you ever watched on Netflix Serving Other People? Hands raised. Yeah, amazing. So he's a comedian. He's an actor. Servant of the People, Netflix has put it back up, but watch even just a couple episodes and it'll blow you away because of the almost parallels to what happened in Ukraine. So he becomes president in 2019, and he's one of the most effective communicators on the world scene and within Ukraine that I think we've ever seen. He's 44 years old. And in some ways, it's interesting to think about Zelensky because a year into his presidency, a year and a half, he came in with over 70% of Ukrainians behind him, and that was already dissipating. People were not that enthused about him anymore. And in some ways, it's this war that has made him into the individual that he is today. People end up in historical times stepping into their roles. Zelensky has clearly done this. And he's very, very good at little zingers, right? He's very good at parodying Russia. And we all love that, right? He's just a very good spokesman. When you attack us, you will see our faces, not our backs, in a reference to already the Russian troops fleeing. So with help from the West, Ukraine starts to push back. One of the big symbolic humiliating acts was the sinking of the Russian flagship Moskva in April. That was with US assistance, not directly, but we are already sharing intelligence with Ukrainians by that point, and that helps them do their targeting. As we go on, Ukraine starts to retake territory. Let's look at Kharkiv, what it looked like before, what the Ukrainians retaking it, and what they're left with. These were cities. Kharkiv is the second largest city in Ukraine, bitterly fought over. And now as Ukraine goes back into it, this is what they're left with. And so by the end of the summer, we find that Putin is under serious pressure. From whom? He's under pressure at home from right-wing forces. He's not under pressure from peace activists saying, oh, we need to stop this. He's under pressure from people even further to the right than he is, who are furious at the unfolding of this military disaster. They want to find someone to blame. They want to point fingers, and they say, we have to do something more. We have to escalate. We have to use more devastating weapons. We have to decapitate the Ukrainian government. We have to go all out after civilians, more than we've seen. And they're not necessarily anti-Putin, but they are it's a scathing criticism of the Russian military. So what happens is in September, Putin calls for annexation of the 4 provinces. So now we're getting into near-term history. And then he declares martial law. For the first time since World War II, he calls up mobilization. He mobilizes his country, something that the people were telling him he needed to do. And what was the reaction to mobilization? We all saw it on the news, people fleeing out of Russia. You know, long lines. Look at this picture, trying to get into Georgia, to Kazakhstan, to, you know, anywhere that they can get across the border, because they don't want to be part of this. They don't want to be fodder being sent to the front lines. And meanwhile, we also have, for the first time, Putin warning of use of nuclear weapons. In other words, he is under so much pressure. He is looking for ways to turn this situation around, because he is somebody who cannot be beaten in his own head. I think we know other people like this too. You don't back down. You do not back down ever. Okay. So what happens then? Well, the Ukrainians, far from being intimidated, in October, they attack the Kerch Bridge. Okay, now this is a really important symbolic thing for Putin, because you have to realize some of it is strategy, but some of it is very personal for Putin himself. All right. Putin was personally invested in this bridge. All right. This is him when it opened in 2018 at a cost of $3.7 billion. Putin personally came and drove the first truck over the bridge. He invested his own self into it. And let me go back to why this was so important. And we're going to focus on Crimea quite a bit today. I'll come back to it. But so here's Crimea, annexed in 2014. And yet there was no way of directly getting to Russia from there. This is actually split where this marker is, unless you were going by ferry or by airplane. Because by this point, after Putin annexed it, Ukraine cut off railroad ties to Crimea and made it very difficult to get out that way. And so you're talking about anybody on Crimea having to go on a ferry. And there's 2 mountain ranges on either side where that is. And so imagine in the winter, the wind howling through and the ice flows. I mean, it wasn't an easy way to get through. And so Putin, when he took Crimea, he said, I've got to make this a success, right? So one of the ways to do that was to invest in this bridge that opened, let's go back to this, in 2018, and the locals were just ecstatic. So it was very, very important step for Putin to normalize conditions on Crimea to make it livable for him. So after that blow, what Russia did is started the most intense shelling of Ukraine since the beginning of the war. And this is just in the last 2 or 3 weeks, right? All out attacks on civilian targets, energy infrastructure. It's estimated now, this is a picture of an Iranian kamikaze drone that I'm sure you saw on the news. And that says something about, you know, where Russia's military supplies are coming from. North Korea and Iran at this point, you know, they're clearly having problems with supplies themselves. But the attacks themselves went after the energy infrastructure, so that just last week, they were saying that 30% of all of Ukraine's energy infrastructure were down. And this is a picture, if you can see, taken of basically the blackout of what you're left with in. So think of this as we head into winter, and maybe you can't heat your house anymore. Maybe you don't have lights. As attacks are coming in, you're again seeking shelter and bomb shelters. I mean, you know, just think about what this means for Ukrainians as the winter approaches. So today, and this is obviously a picture, you know, we need to think about this in personal terms. The idea that there are shortages, there are food shortages, and yet the Ukrainians are still saying that they will stay with this conflict until they win. So where we are today, literally this week, is all eyes are on Kherson. Okay, I don't know if you can see that just below Odessa. The point again about Kherson is its relationship to Crimea, and everything is going to come back to Crimea. That if you're going to make Crimea usable, then you have to have the surrounding areas also under control, so you can get water in, you can get energy out, and all of these things. So Kherson happens to be the first city west of the Dnieper. Okay, you can kind of see the river coming through here. And that has always tended to be a dividing line in Ukraine. For on the east, it's tended to be kind of pro-Russian or Russian language dominated. And on the west, it's tended to be Ukraine. And so this was the first city that Russia was able to take on the west side of the Dnieper. And so it's hugely important to Russia for Crimea, but it's also hugely important to Ukraine. And what you will hear on the news, even this morning, is that this is going to be one of the greatest pitched battles of this entire war. And just start thinking what that's going to mean when, it's not clear that there are any boundaries in terms of, where the front line is going to be. Meanwhile, what do we have is this past weekend, we had the very unsettling picture of the Russian Defense Minister, Shoigu, contacting our Secretary of Defense, Austin, and having two conversations. Now, of course, we're not privy to what those conversations are about, but the Russians lost no time in saying that they're sending up the signal that they believe Ukraine has a dirty bomb that they're going to set off. And again, against the backdrop of this huge battle that both sides are anticipating in the coming days. So basically, then Russia is saying, well, Ukraine has a dirty bomb, which basically means you've got a conventional weapon, a way of igniting it, but you've got radioactive material that could then be spread out all over. All right. Now, the U.S. has looked into it. Our allies have looked into it, and they said, nah, we don't think that Ukraine has this. And Russia before has kind of said something like this almost because they're thinking of doing something, and so it's a way of deflecting that attention, right? Or does it mean that if Russia is saying that Ukraine is going to set off a nuclear bomb, then they can preempt that and go first? Any way you look at it, it's not good, right? If we move to a point where we're talking about a use of tactical nuclear weapons, I don't have to tell you what that could mean. And that really shows just how dangerous this conflict has become, not just for Russia and Ukraine, but for the world. So, and I think what it shows is that the bottom line is no one is backing down, right? There's not one sense here that somebody is going to back down. Instead, both sides are talking about escalation and where is that going to go, and winter is coming. And in fact, another question is, since Russia annexed these 4 territories that were part of Ukraine, then does that mean that if Ukraine takes them back, that they will actually be attacking Russian territory, which again would justify Russia to do certain things in its own kind of twisted logic? So it's very, very, very dangerous. U.S. has provided plenty of weaponry, but I think what the U.S. and Western allies have been careful to do is to not give things to Ukraine that would put Russian territory directly at threat, because we don't know where that would go in terms of how Russia would respond. Okay, so what does Putin want? So let's just look at the Soviet Union right here, okay? Look at the territory that they lost with the disillusionment, that was right, what do we call that? After the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia ended up losing, if you want to look at it that way, a third of its territory and half of its people. 5 years after the breakup, so the breakup was in 2000. 5 years later, 2 out of 3 Russians thought the breakup caused more harm than good. No, I was off by a decade, but you know what I'm saying. 2001, 74% of Russians said that they regretted the collapse. And when you think about this territory, it's kind of like what the video we were just watching. You have to look at borders, and Russia has always been comfortable having this buffer area to protect itself. As he said with Putin, the demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. Okay, but I think this is another interesting map, because even without the Soviet Union, look at what the Russian Empire was before that. And so we're talking about going back as far as 1300, bringing it forward to today. Thank goodness Alaska seems to be clearly settled. So, good thing there. But Russia has always had this concept of being an empire, right? And I asked the question to you, can Russia be Russia if it doesn't have an empire, if it doesn't have that extra territory? Russians would ask that question. And we have to think about that as well if we're looking for stability in the future. All right, so the first thing that Putin wants is to be great again, to reverse humiliation. The second thing that Putin wants is to find a way to stop the US and NATO. So since the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991, NATO has expanded directly to Russian borders. So let's go back to the initial, after the breakup of the Soviet Union in 91, that was Bush President Sr. He is actually one of the few presidents that Putin and other Russians describe in positive terms, because right after the Soviet Union collapsed, President Bush Sr. understood how delicate the situation was, and even Putin, when Bush died, talked about the respect that Bush showed to Russia during this very painful time. And then who did you have next? You had then Clinton come on, and Clinton and Yeltsin had a fabulous relationship. Fabulous. They had so much fun together, the playing of music and the dancing and all the rest. And you would have thought if two people could bring about a better relationship, it would have been those two people. But by the end of that decade, we're already seeing time of trouble. And that is, look at 1999 here, that this is the very last year of the Yeltsin time with Clinton. And despite good relations, 3 countries of the former Warsaw Pact joined NATO. Okay, that's fine. But then the other thing that happened that the Russians continue to talk about is we bombed Serbia at that time. NATO did, without any UN resolution that would kind of legalize it. And Serbia is a very good friend of Russia. They were very upset by this, and yet that's what NATO did. And it really put a fine point for the Russians of saying that their opinion doesn't really count, that under this new unipolar world, the US and NATO will do what they want to do. And then we move on. Let's see. All right. So this is today. If you are a Russian military leader and you're worried about your security, this is what the world looks like to you, right? And so during the Push years, 7 more countries joined NATO, including the Baltic states and including Bulgaria, all directly on Russia's borders. And then almost incredibly, there started to be talk about maybe Georgia and Ukraine joining NATO. So it became something where even today, Russia experts are split on whether Russian concern over being encircled by NATO is genuine or it's just something that the Russians have as a grievance to complain about. I don't know how we would resolve that, but I have to say that if I were a military leader looking at that, you certainly have to take that into account, don't you? It's reality. So, and the other thing, though, is to think about is that brings us to the third thing that Putin has as an objective, and that is he wants to keep Ukraine in the Russian orbit. So, all right, this takes us to Ukraine became independent for the first time when the Soviet Union collapsed. Okay, it's finally, except for a very short time during the Russian Civil War, during the revolution, 1917, it's the first time that Ukraine has ever been an independent country. And it is ruled mainly by pro-Russian leaders. And it has a lot of problems with it. But as I said earlier, let's see if we have a picture of, okay. This is a picture that roughly, and I don't want to say that this is the only thing that's important, but again, roughly Ukraine, the eastern part of the country was more pro-Russian, spoke more Russian, and then the western part of Ukraine tended to be more Catholic and spoke Ukrainian, that sort of thing. But in 2014, Ukraine is developing as a country, isn't it? It's now been independent for almost 20 years. And you had what's called the Maidan Revolution, where people came out on the streets demanding that Ukraine become closer to the West, that Ukraine join the EU if that's possible, that Ukraine, look at NATO, that sort of thing. And at this point, the pro-Russian leader at the time was kicked out. And so the street demonstrations here basically were successful. And so this happened just in February of 2014. And it was only days later that Putin then went into Crimea. And so why is that? So he's looking at in 2014 and he's saying, oh my gosh, this country is going to vote with its feet basically and go west, which means that I will no longer have control over it. So what do I want to do? I want to make sure that I get Crimea, which is where the naval port is. And we're going to come back to that, but it was part of the Russian sphere for since Catherine the Great. Now, of course, the great irony in all of this in terms of what Putin wanted is by his heavy-handedness, he pushed everybody in the opposite direction. So instead of thwarting NATO, what are we going to have now? We're going to have Sweden and Finland join another huge border with Russia that is going to be part of NATO. Instead of breaking up the West has come together like never before to support Ukraine. And so he's had exactly the opposite consequences to what he thought he could do. And indeed, what I would say through all of this conflict is, we tend to think, particularly for autocratic leaders, that because they don't have to account to other constituencies for the most part, that they can be more nimble, they're probably smarter, they're strategic. Putin has miscalculated every step of the way. This whole thing was a huge mistake. And so what that suggests is, even as we go forward and we think about escalation, we can't just assume that he's always going to do the right or the best thing. He has clearly shown that he will take opportunity and take chances and risks that will have consequences that could be very dangerous for all of us, really. So, Oh, and so, yeah, I mean, the point is, and so here he is hoping to split Ukraine off. And if anything, you know, the US has been completely consistent with supporting Ukraine with weapons, with humanitarian aid. And again, just look at these two charts of where NATO forces are actually deployed these days and the repositioning of them in order to protect the NATO countries. In other words, we have made it very, very clear to Russia, Ukraine is not a NATO country, but the countries that are NATO, if they end up being involved in this, then, you know, NATO will respond because it's a NATO member. And so it's no surprise then that other people say, oh, we want to join NATO too, when you've got such a big bully, right, on your side. So do you know that old story about it's a children's fable, and the guy is walking along and the wind and the sun decide to have a competition. Oh, who can get his coat off of him? It was something like that, right? And the wind says, oh, I can do this. And the wind blows and blows and blows. And the man just kind of brings his coat closer around him and he hunches down. And the sun says, get out of here. I can do a better job than that. And the sun comes out and he shines. And it got warm. And the man relaxes and he takes his coat off. All right. I mean, this is Putin today. It's any country. If we're going to be bullies towards countries, towards people, you know, typically you're going to get your back up and you're not going to, you know, give into that. And so it's a question of human psychology here too. All right. So the last section that I want to go to, and then we'll have discussion, is so Russia, then the past as prologue. All right. I'd like to hear your views on the video too, but I'll tell you the one thing that struck me was this slide that he had. You remember seeing that? He was talking about Russia's vulnerabilities. And he said unequivocally, Belarus and Ukraine must be under Russian control for Russia to feel secure. Okay, so what do we do with that? So like nothing else, war has pushed Ukraine into a fully identifiable country, right? Can anyone dispute that Ukraine is not a real country? It has its own language, it has its own culture, has a desire for independence, it has its own military force. And yet what Putin was arguing when going into Ukraine is that it's not a real country. He says this. He says this to American leaders. You know, it's not a real country. No. All right. So obviously Russia needs to accept the reality that Ukraine's a real country, right? You can't coddle them and say, oh yeah, well, let's just get rid of Ukraine at this point. But indeed, you've got a part of Russia that is so extreme to the right that they view Ukraine as subhumans. All right. Just a few days ago, there was somebody on in Russia media, and thank goodness he was kicked off the team, but he said these Ukrainian orphans that are coming into Russia, we shouldn't be adopting them. We should be killing them outright. They're subhumans. So, but that's not all of Russia, obviously, is it? I think I don't know about you. I know plenty of Russians from working there for so many years, and they don't feel that way. As with any other country, it's made up of diverse opinions, you know, diverse backgrounds. There's been so much intermarrying between, you know, all of these different areas of the Soviet Union that for many people, they have one family member in Russia, one family member in Ukraine. But still, Belarus and Ukraine must be under Russian control for Russia to feel secure. All right, how important is it for Russia to feel secure? I mean, but these are huge issues. Nothing that I can just say, oh, this is the answer. It's split, isn't it? And what do we think about, you know, NATO in this case? All right, so then what do we think about Crimea? Because I think you're going to find that in the next year, you're going to hear a lot about Crimea, because ultimately this conflict has to be settled. right? Conflict is always settled through negotiations, even though nobody wants that right now. Nobody seems ready for it right now. But what would negotiations look like? All right. Ukraine is talking, Zelensky is talking about total victory of Russian removal from all of the territories that used to be Ukraine. All right. Let's come back to Crimea and Kherson. So, all right. This map. So in the late 18th century, the time that we were having our war for independence, Crimea became part of the Russian Empire under Catherine the Great. There's actually, I just watched this a couple of weeks ago. There's some, I don't know if it's on Netflix or Prime or whatever, but it's a 4-part series. Helen Mirren plays Catherine the Great, a lot of sex in it. But anyway, but it's interesting because it takes you back to that period. Here we are in America struggling for our independence, and over there in Russia, right? Even if not all of it is true, that it is factually correct that with Potemkin, who is somebody she was very close to, she sent him down to the area to say, yes, we're going to take Crimea. We have an opportunity to do this. Crimea at that time was basically, it had Turkic peoples living on it. It was part of the Ottoman Empire that would come. And so why did it become important to even take Crimea at that time? Well, right away, they gained access to a warm water port. When you look at that big map of Russia, it all feeds into the north. Now, with global warming, the Arctic is opening up, unfortunately. But for all of this time, this has been the only way for them to have a naval base that would allow them out through warm water into the Mediterranean and out. It's a big deal. It's a gateway to then gaining a foothold throughout this whole area. And so they founded, under Potemkin, they founded new cities. Sevastopol is the naval base. They founded Kherson. They founded Odessa. All right. This is one of the St. Vladimir Cathedral is outside of Sevastopol. And again, it was earlier Greek influence, and then it was Turkish influence. But even look at the name in Greek, Kherson, Chersonisus. You know, they're hearkening back to 1,000 years, 2,000 years ago of history, and trying to use that for their own. And who want Crimea, particularly if you live in Moscow? You know, of course. Oh, of course. You know, that it makes total sense, doesn't it? And here's Kherson. Now, of course, this will probably all be destroyed. But again, this was taken from by Catherine the Great and Potemkin. And in fact, Potemkin is actually buried in this cathedral in Kherson. So what happened with Crimea after this time? Okay. So in 1954, Khrushchev, who himself is Ukrainian, he gave Crimea to Ukraine. Otherwise, it was part of Russia all that time. And then it was part of the Soviet Union, where everybody belongs to everybody else, really. So it was an administrative transfer. It was all part of the Soviet Union. But this intentionally happened on the 300th anniversary of a treaty called the Pereslav Treaty, 1654, which happens to mark Ukraine's incorporation into the Russian state and showing fealty to the Russian state, because the Ukrainians at that time were afraid of the Poles coming in and dominating. I mean, you know, the history, you have to decide how far back to go, and then what pieces you want to pull forward, and then how you want to interpret those pieces. But I'm giving you what it looks like from the Russian kind of nationalist perspective, right? So Khrushchev gives Crimea to Ukraine, but really in the context that it's all the Soviet Union, and it's done on the day that Ukraine declared its fealty to Russia. And so it was more just an administrative transfer of, oh, we're all one happy family in the Soviet Union. And that, of course, nobody thought that was going to collapse, and it did. And to this day, that you will have pro-Russian Ukrainian leaders that continue to celebrate that day. Now, maybe they're making it up, but it is a real date. So then, as Ukraine seems to be slipping from the Russian orbit in 2014, right? The Maidan protests, the huge crowds coming out, Crimea was clearly on Putin's mind. So he goes in and he annexes it. Now let's look at what the reaction is in Russia. Oh my gosh, they loved it. It was a wildly popular move. People wept. People wept when Putin came back and declared that after a long, hard, and exhaustive journey at sea, Crimea and Sevastopol are returning to their home harbor, to the native shores, to the home port, to Russia, right? And I mean, you can see that. Imagine if you were in Russia and you had learned all of that history. You gained it back. And we just saw how beautiful it is. Yeah, who wouldn't want it? Sorry. So I just want you to understand that history, that when we go into negotiations, I don't know when, and you have to understand what each side is thinking of in terms of the historic precedent, and how important that is, and how to interpret it in today's context. Obviously, historical possession is not the whole story. We've seen lots of empires come and go. Get used to it. Great Britain no longer, controls everything. That's just one of many examples. Other countries have had to give up their empires as well. And when we think about this historical period of the Russian Empire, just like other empires, the peoples that Russia is controlling are not treated equally. They're not, they are almost subhuman. Russia administers it. When Russia wants to extend serfdom to Ukraine or whatever, that happens. All the decisions are made in Russia. And so, even though you say, oh, they owned all of this territory, well, but you look at the controls that they had put in place to do that, and you say, well, is that even fair? But the point is, when we get to negotiations, who's going to decide? And who is ever going to help mediate between here? You're going to have to understand what the Russians bring to the table, what the Ukrainians bring to the table, and try to juggle all of that. And in the end, it's going to be a compromise. There's no way to go beyond that. Nobody is ready for that now, but how could it be resolved otherwise? Otherwise, it's just endless fighting. So when we look at today, here we are, regardless of the reasons that Russia attacked, it is what it is, and it's a mess. Russia's trying to figure out what level of atrocity will bring Ukraine to its knees. And short of that, they are hoping that political changes here in the United States and in Europe will lessen support for Ukraine. That's what they're betting on. Ukraine is battling for its life and simply trying to stay alive. Zelensky needs the US and European coalition to stay together to get him through the winter without heat. We're going to see a lot of grim pictures. The US, we're hoping that something changes in Russia. We're hoping that somebody replaces Putin, who we could talk to. All right. It would be like if somebody moved him out, it would just be a brand new start that you could sit down with the new person and start, sorting it out. The problem is we fear that the next person could be worse. So the one thing I feel very confident in predicting is that the fighting that continues is going to further radicalize all sides. Whatever we see today, it's going to be worse in a year. And from the US perspective, this war is not in our interest. When we look at what the energy costs are going to do across the board, we already see in other countries, this could bring allies down. It already has people going to the street saying we can't afford this any longer. The longer the war goes on, the more unstable the world will become, unfortunately. So we need an off-ramp We need talks, but we need to also have talks away from the spotlight, but we're headed into winter. All right, I'm sorry. So now it's 2:15. So questions, comments, please.
You probably answered some of my question, but I was wondering how they were able to take Crimea that the Obama administration didn't get involved in, that I know of in any
No.
way.
No, we basically, we did sanctions. But again, what were we going to do? Go in militarily? And so we treated it as a fait accompli. And Russia did not have to use a lot of force. They immediately held, a referendum there. And for the most part, the Crimeans said, oh, yeah, we want to be part of Russia, that sort of thing. It's all, anyway, they're very clever at doing these things. Yeah.
So is that true that the people of Crimea do want to be part of Russia?
Yeah, it's tricky asking who even are the people of Crimea, all right? Because they're really not Ukrainians. They're really not Russians, except that, you've got Russians throughout their empire that they go and they populate these areas. So who were the real inhabitants of Crimea? The Crimean Tatars. And in 1944, because Germany had taken Crimea, so Stalin tended to regard anybody who was still living where the Nazis were as collaborators. And so the Crimean Tatars that were, say, 40% of the population, the only ones with a genuine claim to being from there, Stalin took every last one of them and deported them. Half of them died, 100,000, and the other half were sent way into Siberia. And they've only been trickling back a little bit since then. But that's a legitimate question as well. If we're going to have negotiations, should we have the Crimean Tatars there as well? And I've seen that from people who, are now talking about indigenous voices. So it's a very complicated thing.
Does Ukraine have superior weapons compared to what Russia has?
I mean, how do we assess that except by what you see on the battlefield and what's working? Ukraine has gotten terrific weapons from the West, from the United States, and Russia clearly has been moving through its stock. Does not have the supply lines like we do. And that's why they've turned to North Korea and Iran for help. So yeah, I don't know how to answer that. Yeah.
We pause just for a minute for the questions here to get some questions online.
So from Anne, there's pressure from some in Congress to reduce our support of Ukraine, citing our economic problems and the deficit. Do you think we might draw back our support, and what would be the result?
Right. So it's coming again from two sources for Biden. One is this letter that the Progressive Coalition, whatever you call that, sent to him saying, we need negotiations. And now I understand that they wrote that during the summer and it finally got sent kind of belatedly and they've already withdrawn it. But, that's a tricky thing to say, we have to have negotiations, because when you finally sit down at that table, you want to appear really strong and not under duress. And so what does it say to Putin if he says, oh, you're under so much pressure that you have to sit at the table and thus you're going to give me more things, right? So that, I think, is unfortunate. If you're going to do negotiations, they have to be quiet. You have to keep them away from the spotlight. You have to keep them away from things like that. Now, the other point of pressure, though, is Kevin McCarthy saying that, yes, we're not going to have an open checkbook for Ukraine any longer. I mean, yes, we have committed billions to go to Ukraine. And so you say, well, why are we doing that? It's costing too much money. But what's the alternative again? And then that kind of goes back into the whole Trump land thing with Zelensky, which I'm sure you remember. But I mean, this is a very complicated history of Trump basically trying to blackmail Zelensky, and so Zelensky has been here before. He knows not to get involved with US politics at all, because he knows it will only end up badly.
Okay, we can have more questions. Just want to make a quick comment though, because this morning I spoke with two of my Ukrainian teacher friends online through Zoom, and they live in a village in the West, and they were without electricity for 4 hours, and they would certainly not support negotiations. They're, it's our motherland, we're loyal. I mean, they said this to me this morning.
My question has to do with NATO Article 5. Could you explain to us what that is and what would trigger that in this situation?
Article 5 says that attack on one of our members it doesn't say that there's an automatic response, but it says that it will meet with a NATO response to be determined. So when we were 9/11, that, a NATO member has been attacked. And so the other NATO members came together to say, what can we do to be supportive? That's what Article 5 is. And in this case, at least right now, I think it's been made pretty clear that an attack on the Baltic states or any of these surrounding states, Russia has been very careful not to have stray missiles go into these NATO countries, because that really would be a very complicating factor. So, yeah.
In your expert opinion, to what degree would you consider this a proxy war for the U.S. at this point?
Oh, I wouldn't frame it that way at all. Russia may see it that way, but it's not like we chose to start this. But all right, but yeah, to be fair, I mean, when Defense Secretary Austin, made a statement 4 or 5 months ago that our objective is to weaken Russia, right? And I think he meant it more on its face. Of course, we want to weaken Russia so they can't bully and pummel another country, but that could also be read, and there are definitely people in this country. Every country has a wide range of views, don't we? And there are people here that say, yes, we should go for the jugular. We should just take this opportunity to just, put an end to Russia, whatever that might mean. But there are people who argue things like that. I think at the end of the day, countries will be there, right? And you have to deal with countries the way they are. And that's where even the outrage that we feel towards Russia, it is absolutely legitimate. But as we ever do go into negotiations and things, we have to be careful that we also don't try to humiliate other countries. Again, let's just look back to, before World War II and the rise of Hitler and those conditions that were imposed on Germany at the time. It's a really tricky business, isn't it? And countries are going to exist. And so we kind of have to take them as they are. It doesn't mean that we have to approve of what they do or embrace them, but at the same time, I don't think we also need to force them to their knees, but other people do. Other people do.
I think we learned in World War II that appeasement doesn't work.
Right.
Hitler was never satisfied, and I don't think Putin will be either. And so that's always a danger. When do you say stop? That's all. You can't take this.
Right. Well, I think we're at that point right now, saying stop. Right now, everything that we have done with Ukraine, I think, has been very forceful. People will argue that we should have done it sooner, but we clearly are saying to Russia right now, there is no cracks in our approach of saying stop. And I do appreciate that, because one could argue that the fact that Obama did not react to Crimea, that, when other things happened and basically we let them slide, that, and then our withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was such a mess, and that Putin really did get the impression that he could get away with this. And so, yes, That's part of it as well. You know what? I always think of this. I bet you all have had children, or a lot of you have had children, right? And think about when you're raising your teenager and you're trying to get your teenager to stop doing something or to start doing something else. Think of how psychological that is. And I often think of that in terms of how we're trying to deal with a country like Russia, right? We need to somehow be the adult in the room, unemotional, but at the same time, not patronizing, not making our teen feel like, you know, they're just humiliated because they're going to fight back against that too. We've seen that Putin being a bully, it's blown back in his face, and we have to be careful about not doing that same thing, don't we? And I think it's like dealing with a teenager. So,
is there any significance to the what's his name, the Ukrainian?
Oh, Zelensky?
Yeah, Zelensky's, what he wore when their conference he was having, he had rolled up sleeves. Power. Not going to give in.
Right. Oh, I think Zelensky is masterful. I think he's amazing. The thing that scares me the most is what would happen if he gets wiped out somehow. He is Russia's #1 target. There's no question. Who would replace him? Right? Who has that ability to communicate like he does, who every night is on looking, you know, the way he does. He's amazing. He is who Ukraine needs at this time. And again, we have to remember that Ukraine, they're looking very coherent now, but they have not been that way historically. And of course, they've been subjected to, you know, empire for, you know, hundreds of years. But the fact is, Ukraine has been a very, very corrupt country. Ukraine has been very, very divided. And so you wonder if once you finally strip away war is unifying them. If they didn't have that unifying threat, you know, I think we'd find that Ukraine is not as perfect as we kind of think of it right now. But that's true with any country, isn't it? Yeah.
Okay, now we have another
I have not seen the fact that he does have, I think it's a Jewish grandparent. And thankfully, that has simply worked in Ukraine's favor because what Putin is always saying is that the Ukrainians are fascists. And again, there's no question that Ukraine has a history of fascism. All right. Again, you go back to World War II. And yet the fact that Zelensky does have that Jewish blood, thank God, has allowed them to say, come on, how can he be a fascist when he's part Jewish? So
we have another online question.
Yeah.
From Bill, are U.S. military analysts surprised at the apparent level of Russian military incompetence?
Yes.
Okay, I think we only have time for one more question.
Oh.
You mentioned you thought that Putin realized he had made a mistake. The Russian army probably realizes that they've made a mistake. You showed the slide of all the people going to the border to escape conscription. Is there any chance that they might try to overthrow their government?
Well, that's what we're hoping. And that's what, you know, again, you know, you go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that was a mistake. Khrushchev made a mistake, let's call it a miscalculation. And within what, 2 years, or was it 3, he was gone. Putin has miscalculated. He cannot be allowed to remain where he is. That's ridiculous. This has been a disaster for Russia. It's been a disaster for, you know, many peoples, but it's been a disaster for Russia, no question. So the question is, how do you do that? At least during Khrushchev's time, there was a Politburo and there was a structure beyond just Khrushchev that could eventually mobilize and move him out. Putin has become such an extreme autocrat, like a czar, that who around him could get close enough and somehow push him out. There's no structure to do that. And so then you say, well, it's all perception, right? If people perceive that Russia is losing and that, Putin is making mistake after mistake, presumably somebody is going to get together in some corner and do something about him, push him out of a window or do something, right? But then who will those next people be? Because then we're going to see that Russia itself is extremely divided. I'm not sure we're going to see another Gorbachev figure or even a Yeltsin for that matter. It could be an even worse person. At the same time, if it's different, I would say at least it offers a new opportunity. I could imagine that if Putin were gone, then all of a sudden you have somebody come in and at least in that flurry of newness, you could say, oh, well, let's at least sit down and talk, or at least, do something. And I could see that could at least provide a narrow window. There has to be discussions going on. And the last thing I'll leave with you is in terms of when we're talking about diplomacy, our numbers of diplomats in Russia are lower than they have ever been in modern times. In 2018, we closed St. Petersburg, then we closed Vladivostok, we closed Yekaterinburg that Jack and I opened 28 years ago now. And our staff in Moscow was reduced to 1/10 of what we had. So, and we didn't have time to get into all of those back and forth over the last 5 years that brought us to that state, but there's not much dialogue going on. And so the only dialogue I'm hearing is, okay, at least you had the defense ministers talk. That's very important, isn't it? Any talk is good. And then you do have some back communications being done to try to get our hostages out. I'm calling them hostages, Brittany Griner and Todd. Anyway, and that was starting from Bill Richardson. But, yeah, you've got to look for ways to connect, because otherwise, how do you even know that somebody is opposed to Putin if you don't even have somebody there talking and figuring out who's there, So I think it's really important to have that FaceTime. Yeah, please. Anybody's welcome to leave, though. Please, you're not going to hurt my feelings.
We're starting to see a divide in our country about our relationship with the Ukraine situation.
Right.
I think we're in a very dangerous position right now. Our country is greatly divided. This is only going to add to it. People don't realize what the effect of this can be.
Yeah.
We'll become the laughing stock of the world instead of the leader of the world.
Yeah, thank you. And, I think it all comes back to where you get your news. And I don't mean this just in America. We've known this for a long time. Here, I love this picture. So if you are in Russia, all right, and Crimea is part of Russia now, the vast majority of people only watch Russian TV. And so they believe in everything that's going on from Putin. And the people who don't believe what's going on is people who get their news from maybe some online sources or have to dig for it. It tends to be younger people, but there's a tremendous divide. And I'm going to have Ian send to you after this. It's a fabulous documentary that was just made where this he's so good at promoting dialogue. And he explores 7 families that have one person on the Russia side and one person on the Ukrainian side, and you just listen to them. And you hear that justification on the Russian side, and then you hear the what you'll understand much more on the Ukrainian side of, this is crazy. But to see that in families, and I watched that and I thought, this is what we have in this country, isn't it? We're talking past each other, and it's all based on where we're getting our news. But yeah, the divisions in countries, and it's every country is divided. I think it is very dangerous. And, you know, what we are looking at is the collapse of the World War II order. And we are entering into a new dangerous period. And yeah, I'm sorry that this is what we're leaving to our children.
I think that you will agree with me that this has been an amazing presentation. So let us show Karen our gratitude.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Outstanding.